a great question about how I got to that. Um, when I left Arkansas, I never wanted anything to do with the farm, working farm life, because I saw my mother work hard. My father passed away, so I saw my mother, I saw her hands look like a man's, and, I did not want that for my life, and she did not want that for my life. And so she encouraged all of her kids to go off to college. That's what we did. And after going off to college and working as a scientist, I realized there was something missing. There was just like you said, with your career, there was just not a lot of meaning, and you wanted to do something you enjoyed. So I started to look around for something that I had passion for. And even though I didn't know very much about coffee at all, I could relate to it because of the past. I could relate to it, and I didn't really fully understand at first why I was relating to it. But it was the fact that it was an agricultural product. It was people who worked in coffee in the fields, just like my family worked in the fields.
Yes.
So, so I became a student of coffee. Excuse me. So I just started to study coffee, just, as an importer. When you're an importer, you have to, whatever country you're going to import from, it's like a whole class of study, because no two countries are the same. Regions can be the same, but not countries. The way they process, the way they sell, the way they receive money, all of that is different. So I was doing a lot of work in East Africa, buying coffees from Kenya, Ethiopia, Tanzania, Rwanda, those places. And each of those countries were different, but they were somewhat similar. And then I started buying coffees from Central America, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala. Much, much easier. It was much easier. I never thought about Brazil. And here's why. Because Brazil is huge. Brazil is thought to, supply all the lower quality coffee into the market. Most buyers of Brazilian coffee, they're not willing to, US buyers, they're not willing to pay a lot for the coffee. And there's so much competition. The US, there's just no reason for me to ever think about Brazil. Until I met my friend Josiane. And Josiane wanted to start to work with women in coffee in the same way that I had done some work with the International Women's Coffee Alliance and helped to build chapters in East Africa. And I saw her heart in Brazil. And so Josiane basically grabbed my attention with Brazil. And I can't exactly tell you how it happened, but she said, "We have Black people in Brazil, Phyllis." I think she realized that I had this affinity for Black people in coffee. And so even though she was doing all her work, and she kept saying to me, when I was a child, I would look out my window and I would see these women walking and going to the fields. And she kept telling me that, but I never really equated it to Black women. And so when we finally got on the same page, that that is where she was trying to get me to focus my attention, I said, "Oh, okay, I'll take a look." So I started my study. And I started asking, this was around 2014, I started asking, where are the Black Brazilians in coffee? Because I noticed I'd not seen any. And I'd not seen many Black Americans in coffee. And I'd not seen, and I kept waiting for someone to say to me, "Oh, well, you haven't met, oh, well, you don't know, oh, well, you haven't heard about," but no one ever did. And I have gone from the US to Asia to Africa to Latin America, working in coffee. standing on stages, meeting people, knowing people directly who run the ICO to every trade organization, every organization in the industry, knowing the biggest players and the smallest players. And no one could stop me. No one could say, you're wrong. You're wrong. And I kept asking that question, where are the Black Brazilians in coffee? And no one could say, oh, but I even said to the executive director for the African Fine Coffees Association, I said, when you go to Brazil, because you take these trips to Brazil, do you meet with Black Brazilians? And he looked at me and he said, why would we do that? They're tractor drivers.
My goodness.
And so I started, I started realizing that we did not know the history. And so I was given the chance to speak at the African Fine Coffees Association conference in February 2019. And I thanked Africa, but I also mentioned the Africans that were taken to Brazil to start the industry. And there were individuals in the audience who served on the Tanzania Coffee Board who said, I didn't know that. I never thought, these are deeply rooted coffee professionals in Africa, because they were taken from the Brazilian African, the Africans who went to Brazil were from West Africa. East Africa is where the specialty coffee is grown. But they didn't know that they didn't even know it. They didn't even know it, which was sad to me. But I started asking the question because I'm Black American. And I grew up on a farm and I know where I came from. And I know that it's not just a history that we leave with. I know that there are descendants. I may not still be in cotton, but cotton is deeply embedded in my roots and in my descendants and in my lineage. And so that question was so simple for me, because I am those Black Brazilian. I am a descendant of Black Americans who worked in cotton. The crop is the only thing that's different. So I posed this question, and I was so incredibly blessed that I posed a question to Josiane. And she's a journalist like you. So she knew that she needed to help find the answer. She introduced me to Miriam from Cachoeira. And Miriam had done some work in this area of empowerment of Black Brazilians. And she was the first woman to take on her family farm. But the first step was, as the Women in Coffee chapters were forming throughout Brazil, there was a chapter in Mantiqueira Mountains where they were Black coffee pickers were joining. And Josiane sent me a picture and she says, look at this, Phyllis. So there were Black and white Brazilians together. And she just said, look, you must come. So I went. It was December 2018, I think, I don't know. It was late. It was like right before, it was right this time of the year, actually.
Okay.
And she said to me, there's no need, don't talk about race, don't talk about this sort of stuff. It's very taboo. Just come and look, just come and meet people. So I did. And I went to meet with the chapter, all the women, the woman who organized it, Letitia, I think is her name. Very nice woman. And so that night we talked about coffee. We were sitting at the table, and since I don't speak Portuguese, we had a translator. And all the Black women at the table talked about their grandparents and how their grandparents taught them how to work in coffee. And the only thing that they held in coffee was these assets that weren't tangible. All the non-Black Brazilians at the table talked about land. They talked about a tangible asset that had been handed down to them. But all the Black Brazilians reminisced on how their fond memories of working with their grandparents and their parents and being together, they had just as much passion for coffee as if they had farms. And after that, the organizers of the event said they started to want to talk to me about coffee because it was obvious sitting there what the difference was. And the next day we had an event, and we went to the event, and the Black Brazilians came to me and they said, you know, I wasn't there to make a big deal out of race. I was just there to listen. So the women who were part of the chapter in Mantiqueira came, and they said they wanted to have a conversation with me. And so they asked the interpreter to come and talk to me. So they started talking to the interpreter, this young lady, white Brazilian. And before she started to speak to me, she started crying. And I thought, this is really strange. This is really strange. I had not really thought about what was happening. But what she said was, when we saw you get out of the car yesterday at the farm, we knew that we were no longer invisible. Our grandparents labored in these fields with no recognition for centuries, but now we're visible. And they went on to tell me their stories. So I didn't have to say, just by physically showing up, right? And they were pickers. So they told me their stories. I have a special notebook where I keep their stories. But just to back up a little bit, when I started to work on this, I decided to take a detour, and I decided to go to Harvard and study for a year. And I was worried that the idea, the program, whatever it was I was supposed to do with this, and working with Miriam and Josiane, I was worried that it would get lost. So Miriam sent me a picture of all her workers, and it was this picture of all these Black ladies getting ready to go to the coffee fields. So I printed it off and I put it in my office when I went to Harvard, because I did not want to lose sight of that. But when I went to Cambridge, when I went there to look for a place for us to stay while my husband and I studied at Harvard, I went to the library. And this is the book I found in the library. First book I bought. This was the first book I bought. It cost me $31. But this right here is a coffee plant. That's a coffee plant by Herbert S. Klein. I'll send it to you. And I read this book from cover to cover. And it talks about when coffee first became the number one, when Brazil became the first number one exporter of coffee in the world.
Okay.
And it was the enslaved who put Brazil in that space, right?
Right.
It was those who were enslaved. And so when I ran across this book, I've lived in a lot of different cities, and it was just, But one thing that happened while I was at Harvard, um, I took a class called Food Science and Agribusiness. The professor was almost 80 years old. It was his last class he was ever going to teach. And he had worked with agricultural people from all over the world. And he invited to every class we had, he invited like an executive or of a food company, or, it was just such a dynamic class. But one class, he invited a Brazilian lawyer who had argued the case at the World Trade Organization against the US and sugar. And it was just such an incredible case because he won. Brazil won. Brazil had taken the US and Europe to the World Trade Organization for disputes about the sugar trade. And so he was in class. And so I had said to myself, look, stop talking in this class. You're older students. They don't want to hear what you got to say. These young kids, it's graduate school, but they don't want to hear what all this stuff you got to say. And so at the end of the class, our guest, he said, I got time for one question, one more question. And I said, don't do it, Phyllis. Don't do it. Don't. And so he said, I'm going to take one more question. He said, who has a question? There's about 75 people in the room. And at Harvard, everybody raises their hand. He looks at me and he says, you. And I was like, oh God, why did he call on me? I got to say it. And I said, I've worked in coffee for 20 years. I've never met one Black Brazilian in coffee. I said, you've talked about making what was wrong right. Where has Brazil tried to make this wrong right? And he was like, I don't have anything to say. I'm just, and I felt really bad. I talked to him after class. He tried to answer the question. But we had lunch after class. But that was on my mind. So that's the story. We all come into an awareness. When we come to the awareness, we look back and we wonder, what have we been thinking, right? I said the same thing. I said, the coffee is in Brazil. The people is in Brazil. The story was in Brazil. I just picked it up. I literally just, there, it is important. It is important that you have a buyer, right? It is important that there's relationships. Sure. But it was all there, and it's all been there. It's been there forever. It has always been there. But it's a testament that sometimes we do need those from the outside to look in order for us to look around, right? Yeah. Only 1% to 2% of Black Americans own farmland. Yes. The disparities are really bad in the US. And even if you don't look at farmland and you look at just wealth, because we had the housing crisis, we had a global housing crisis, Black Americans lost so much. The wealth gap is huge in the United States. I tell you about my mother. My mother had a sixth grade education. She became a mom at 16, but she left us land. And my family is among the 1% to 2% of Black Americans who own land. So my family is a lot like the families in the book. They're among very few. And what's interesting is that people wanted to talk about when I wrote the book, people thought it was common that Black people own land and work in coffee. And I really didn't put a lot of emphasis in how uncommon that is. Um, yeah, I wanted the book to not be so much about what I felt and what I thought, but just about them, their story. Um, it made me so happy because when I hired a photographer to go out, that's another thing.
Mm.
The land was there, the coffee was there, the people was there, the photographer was there. Okay, you guys had it all. You had it all. I had nothing. Okay. Um, but when she sent the pictures for the first time, and I've done a lot of work in Africa, but for the first time, Black people looked like they had position. It looked like they weren't dirty. They weren't just the workers. They weren't there to make other people rich. They were there of their own, of their own ownership. And just going through the pictures, when the photographer sent me the pictures, I was just like, oh my God, these people look so, it just gave me joy that they're not making somebody else wealthy. And they have their troubles, they have their challenges, right? But this is the first step. This is the first step. And oftentimes, Marcia, I will, whenever we buy a new coffee or work in a different place or whatever, I talk to the people, I get their story, I get the pictures, I put it together, and it's in one page. It's like one page. So when I was working on this project, I said, they deserve a book. And when I told him, I said, you deserve a book. And I don't have the time to write it. I don't care how thick it is, but you deserve a book.
Mhm.
So that's why this typically it's just one page, like just like, here's the farmer, here's what they do. But I said, there's the story behind them is so much bigger than just writing it on a one pager. So I was very fortunate. I got a lot of in-kind help. The designer of the book said, we'll do it. Everybody just came in, and all the proceeds from the sale of the book go back to the farmer. And we've sold almost $3,000 for the book. And that money is going to go to the farmers and to the new organization that I've started, the Coffee Coalition for Racial Equity, to try to continue to keep this topic of racial equity at the forefront of the discussion in coffee, because it definitely needs to be there. The next steps in my effort is really going to be spent building this organization, the Coffee Coalition for Racial Equity. It's founded here in the US, in the state of Georgia, the home of Martin Luther King Jr. Our mission is to build greater racial equity, and we're starting at home. I mean, this book is about Brazil, but it's about our connection to Brazil as Americans. And so when racial unrest started in the US with George Floyd murder and the murders prior to that, and we had this opportunity to bring this conversation to the forefront, then, we have to do something. We have to so the Coffee Coalition's mission is to bring about greater racial diversity, to look for those opportunities, to look to see, to bring awareness, to bring visibility. There are things will happen in Brazil just because these farmers are highlighted. Things will already start to happen. You and I are talking because these farmers were highlighted. So just to bring awareness and visibility, the opportunity to exist. Coffee is a $225 billion industry in the US. And African Americans in the US are the lowest ethnic consumption group, according to the National Coffee Data Trends. About 54% of Black Americans consume coffee on a weekly basis versus 76% of white Americans, and Latinos is even higher than that. So it's an opportunity. It's more than just a business opportunity. It's an opportunity, as you said, if Black people in Brazil wouldn't be in favelas if they had owned land and lived on a farm, and they would experience, beautiful lives away from violence. Black people in the US wouldn't have such a wage gap and would not have to experience such low unemployment. And they have connections to people in other countries. Working in coffee for me has been a blessing, because when I work in places, when I go to Africa, there's this kindred among people that are like you, that had similar past. So there's this added benefit, an added benefit of connection and empathy for Black people. Black people in America has suffered just like Black people in Brazil. So there's empathy, there's an understanding. When Louise in the book, who I interviewed, he's on the cover, when he talked about taking his coffee to the local group for them to tell him about the quality, and them treating him as if his coffee belonged to somebody else, the white man that's behind the coffee. When he talked about people driving by his farm and assuming that he's not the owner, all of those things I can relate to as a Black American. And so there are these bridges, these connections that we have that are so closely related that aren't there. Their lives is my life. Their experiences have been it's just been on a different continent, under a different name, spoken in a different language, but it's all the same. I think you have to use the tools that you have. I can't reconform myself to do things I'm not capable of doing. I have to use the voice and the tools that I have. And the tool, I like to write, and I buy coffee. And I implement my elements of change in what I do. That is the backbone of what I do. I wrote an article in 2018 called Strong Black Coffee. So my first attack wasn't on Brazil. My first attack was on the US. My first attack was, where are Black people in coffee? And